What happens when the cross confronts the throne and neither side backs down? 7 clashes between faith and empires, 7 moral earthquakes that shape the world. Blood in arenas, monks defying decrees, kings on their knees, cities in flames, oaths broken. If you love history with a heartbeat and want to understand how Christ rebuilt ruins, stay. It will hurt, it will inspire, and it might change the way you see our times. Subscribe now to the Faith and Power channel, turn on the bell, and comment. Which empire tried the hardest to tame the gospel? We're opening forgotten archives. Today, no one will silence us. This chapter is not neutral, it's honest. It's not a lecture. It's a battle of ideas guided by hope. Take a deep breath and follow me to the very heart of the clash between altar and crown. The first great clash between Christianity and an empire was not merely religious, it was an existential struggle. On one side, the newborn faith that proclaimed, Jesus is Lord. On the other, the pagan Roman Empire which demanded, Caesar is Lord. There was no possible reconciliation. Rome saw worship of the emperor and the official gods as the political cement holding the empire together. For Christians, taking part in it was idolatry. That refusal was viewed as treason. Thus the collision was born, a faith that bowed only to Christ against an empire that would accept no rival. From the 1st century onward, the persecutions began. After the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, Nero blamed the Christians, covering them in tar and burning them as human torches. In the 2nd century, Domitian and Trajan imposed forced oaths of loyalty to the emperor. Those who refused were imprisoned, flogged, and executed. The arenas became symbols of this confrontation. In the Colosseum, amid shouts and applause, ordinary. Men and women, slaves, deserter soldiers, mothers, faced wild beasts and gladiators. They did not fight for glory or country, but for faithfulness to the gospel. Rome saw it as insubordination. Christians saw it as sacred obedience. The peak came in the early 4th century with Diocletian's great persecution, 303-311. Churches were burned, scriptures destroyed, leaders tortured. The goal was clear: to wipe the Christian faith from the face of the empire, but something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, Christianity grew. Each execution was a seed. As early as the 2nd century, Tertullian had already declared, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Historians, even Roman ones, recorded that the number of converts increased as repression intensified. The turning point came in 312, when Constantine, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, is said to have seen in the sky a cross accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces." By this sign you will conquer. He ordered his soldiers to march under the Christian symbol. He won. The following year, in 313, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of worship and returning confiscated properties. Officially, the conflict seemed to have ended. But a new danger arose. Christianity, once persecuted and pure in its marginality, now received imperial privileges. Many saw this as divine providence. Others, as a deadly risk of corruption. The relationship between altar and throne had changed. The cross now adorned military banners, and the emperor took part in theological councils. Christianity had survived the fire, but had entered the palace. Had Rome won, the gospel might have remained confined to underground communities, never shaping civilizations. By winning, however, it paid the price of engaging with power, a price that still echoes today. This first conflict, Christianity against the pagan Roman Empire, taught that faith can withstand the sword, but it can be seduced by the crown. And that lesson would echo in the next great clash when, centuries later, an emperor would be forced to kneel before a bishop. The second great conflict between Christianity and the empire was not fought against pagans, but within an officially Christian empire. The stage was set in the late 4th century. Emperor Theodosius I had declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It seemed the tensions of the past had ended, but history would prove otherwise. In AD 390, in the city of Thessalonica, a popular uprising erupted. It all began when a well-known chariot racer was arrested on charges of immorality. The enraged population attacked the soldiers and killed the city's military commander. Theodosius's reaction was brutal. Overcome with anger and determined to reassert his authority, the emperor ordered a massacre. Roman soldiers surrounded the hippodrome during a public event and slaughtered thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, without distinction. Here lay the conflict. The supreme ruler of a Christian empire committing a mass atrocity. What would the church do? Remain silent out of fear of imperial power, or confront the throne in the name of the gospel? The answer came from Ambrose, Bishop of Milan. He was not a political revolutionary, but he believed that no ruler stood above God's law. Upon hearing of the massacre, he sent a letter to Theodosius, denying him communion until he publicly repented. The message was clear. You are an emperor, but you are also a man, subject to divine judgment. Theodosius resisted. In Rome, after all, the emperor had always been the ultimate authority. But the Christian worldview brought something new. Even the ruler must submit to the justice of God. For months, Ambrose maintained the pressure, forbidding the emperor from participating in the liturgy. Finally, faced with public opinion and spiritual fear, Theodosius yielded. In an unprecedented act, he entered the Cathedral of Milan without imperial regalia, wearing the simple garments of a penitent, and asked forgiveness before the assembly. This act was historic. For the first time, a Christian emperor was publicly humbled, not by a political rival, but by a church leader. It was the symbolic reversal of the first conflict. Now, it was not the empire trying to subdue the faith, but the faith imposing limits on the empire. The consequences were profound. Many saw this as a moral triumph for the church, proving it could restrain abuses of power. Others feared that such a precedent could pave the way for endless disputes between throne and altar. Had Ambrose remained silent, the message might have been that rulers can act without accountability to God. By confronting the emperor, he established a principle that would shape the entire Middle Ages. Secular power is not above divine law. This second conflict, the church against emperor, Theodosius showed that the alliance between cross and crown was no guarantee of peace. On the contrary, closeness could spark fierce clashes when Christian morality confronted imperial politics. And the next great shock would prove that this tension was not confined to the West. On the other side of the empire, a war would be waged, not over territory or tribute, but over images, icons, and the very face of Christ. The third great conflict between Christianity and an empire took place within the gilded walls of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was not about taxes or borders, but about something seemingly simple: sacred images. Yet this dispute would turn into a theological and political war that split the Christian world for more than a century. 8th century Byzantium was officially Christian. Churches and monasteries were filled with icons, paintings and mosaics depicting Christ, Mary, and the saints. For many believers, these images were windows to heaven, but for others, they bordered on idolatry. In AD 726, Emperor Leo III, known as the Isaurian, made a radical decision. He ordered the removal and destruction of all religious icons. He justified his policy by claiming that God had punished the empire with military defeats and earthquakes because of idolatry. This order was not a theological suggestion, but an imperial decree with the force of law. Here was the heart of the conflict, the empire imposing its doctrine on the church, replacing spiritual authority with political authority. Monks and patriarchs who defended the icons, accused the emperor of usurping the role of the bishops. The repression was severe. Monasteries were closed, monks imprisoned, icons burned in public squares. Patriarchs who resisted were deposed. The population split between iconoclasts, destroyers of images, and iconodules, defenders of images. Among the defenders, John of Damascus, a theologian and monk from Syria, stood out, writing passionately against iconoclasm. He argued that since Christ became man, his image could be depicted, for God had taken on a visible form. His writings circulated clandestinely, strengthening the resistance. The conflict was not purely religious, it had a geopolitical dimension. By attacking the icons, the emperor weakened the power of monks and patriarchs, centralizing authority in the imperial throne. It was, in essence, an attempt by the crown to control the altar. The crisis dragged on for decades. In 787, under Empress Irene, the Second Council of Nicaea officially restored the veneration of icons, declaring that honoring images was not idolatry. It seemed like the war was over, but peace was short-lived. In 815, Emperor Leo V revived iconoclasm, restarting the persecutions. Only in 843, under Empress Theodora, was the veneration of images permanently restored, an event still celebrated in the Orthodox Church today as the triumph of orthodoxy. The third conflict, the Byzantine Empire against the Church, in the War of the Images, left deep marks. It showed that even a Christian empire could, through decrees, redefine the practice of faith, sparking bloody divisions. Had the iconoclasts won, sacred art as we know it might have disappeared from Christianity, and the visual identity of churches would forever be different. By resisting, the church preserved not only the images themselves, but also the principle that spiritual authority could not be shaped at the whim of political power. And the next great clash would not come from the palaces of Constantinople, but from the battlefields of the Middle East, where cross and crescent would collide in a struggle for the most sacred city in the world. The fourth great conflict between Christianity and an imperial power did not take place within the borders of Rome or Byzantium, but on the sands and within the walls of the Middle East. It was the direct clash between Christianity and Islam, centered on the city most sacred to both, Jerusalem. Since the 7th century, Jerusalem had been under Muslim rule. For Christians, it was the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. For Muslims, it was the site from which the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. The city had become a symbol of both faith and power. The spark came. In the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire, threatened by the Seljuk Turks, appealed to the West for aid. In 1095, Pope Urban II called upon the kings and knights of Christendom to embark on an expedition to liberate Jerusalem and protect Christian pilgrims who were suffering attacks. The promise was both spiritual and political. Those who marched under the cross would receive forgiveness of sins and eternal glory. The First Crusade was an unexpected military success. In 1099, after a brutal siege, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. The bloodshed was horrific. Both Muslim and Christian sources describe streets filled with corpses. The Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, building fortresses, and founding military orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers. But the Christian victory was temporary. In the following centuries, Muslim leaders reorganized their forces. The most iconic figure was Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who in 1187 defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. Unlike the conquerors of 1099, Saladin spared most of the inhabitants and allowed Christians to leave peacefully. The conflict was not only about the city itself, but about spiritual and geopolitical control of the Middle East. Later Crusades attempted to reclaim Jerusalem, but with limited success. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, resulted in an agreement granting Christian access to the holy sites while leaving the city under Muslim control. This fourth conflict, Christianity versus Islam for the possession of Jerusalem, blended devotion and ambition. For many warriors, the crusade was armed penance. For others, it was an opportunity for conquest and wealth. For leaders, it was as much about faith as it was about strategy, securing trade routes and vital military positions. The consequences were profound. Culturally, the Crusades opened channels of exchange between East and West, leading to contact with Islamic science, medicine, and philosophy. But they also left a legacy of resentment and mistrust that still echoes in Christian-Muslim relations today. Had Christianity held Jerusalem indefinitely, the political and religious map of the Middle East might be unrecognizable today. But Islam's final victory over the Crusader states showed that no power could hold the holy city forever by the force of arms. The fourth conflict demonstrated that when faith allies itself with war, it produces both triumphs and tragedies in equal measure. And this lesson would echo in the next great clash, one not against a rival religion, but between the Church itself and a Christian emperor of Europe, in a confrontation that would force a king to cross snow-covered mountains to seek forgiveness. The fifth great conflict between Christianity and an imperial power did not involve pagans or another religion, but an internal battle for control of the Church itself. It was the direct clash between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th century, known as the Investiture Controversy. The core issue was simple to state but explosive in its consequences. Who had the authority to appoint bishops and church leaders, the Pope or the Emperor? For centuries, kings and emperors had appointed bishops and abbots, granting them lands and privileges. This practice strengthened political alliances but also opened the door to corruption. In 1075, Gregory VII, a reformist pope, issued the Decisive, Papae, declaring that only the Pope had the authority to invest bishops and that spiritual power stood above secular power. For Henry IV, this was an intolerable affront. Appointing bishops was part of his political domain. Losing that right meant weakening his control over the empire. The conflict erupted when Henry ignored the papal decree and continued to appoint bishops. Gregory responded by excommunicating him and releasing his subjects from their oath of obedience. Excommunication was not merely a religious act, it was a devastating political blow. Many German nobles, already discontent with Henry, seized the opportunity to rebel. Under pressure and fearing the loss of his throne, Henry made a dramatic gesture. In the winter of 1077, he crossed the snow-covered Alps to the castle of Canossa, in Italy, where the Pope was staying. There, he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, dressed as a penitent, begging for papal forgiveness. Gregory eventually absolved him, but the gesture did not end the conflict. In the following years, Henry once again confronted the Pope, even going so far as to invade Rome and install an anti-pope. The struggle between the two authorities continued intermittently until the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which established a compromise. The Pope would invest bishops with spiritual authority, while the Emperor retained some control over their temporal lands. This fifth conflict, papacy versus Holy Roman Empire in the Investiture Controversy, was more than an administrative dispute. It defined the boundaries between spiritual power and temporal power in medieval Europe. For the first time, a pope had succeeded in humiliating an emperor and forcing him to submit publicly. But it also became clear that the throne would never fully yield. Had Henry won without concessions, the Church might have become little more than a department of the state. By resisting, Gregory preserved ecclesiastical independence, but sowed seeds of rivalry that would sprout into future wars. This clash left a deep cultural mark. The image of a king kneeling in the snow before the Pope became a symbol of the Church's moral power over rulers. But it also revealed that alliances between cross and crown could unravel into storms of pride and authority. The next conflict would carry this tension far beyond Europe. Crossing oceans, soldiers, priests, and navigators would take the Christian faith to new worlds, but with it, also the sword, slavery, and moral dilemmas that would drive some missionaries to denounce their own kings. The sixth great conflict between Christianity and imperial power began in the late 15th century, when Spain and Portugal, strengthened by the Reconquista and maritime expansion, carried both the cross and the sword to the Americas. Officially, it was the mission of bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. In practice, it was also a vast operation of conquest, exploitation, and cultural domination. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the bull Inter Caetera, granting the Catholic monarchs of Spain and Portugal the right to colonize and evangelize newly discovered lands, provided they converted the inhabitants to Christianity. Here lay the core tension: evangelization as a spiritual mission versus evangelization as a justification for imperial domination. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro used the faith as legitimacy. Entire populations were gathered to hear the reading of the Requerimiento, a document that, in the name of the king and the pope, demanded submission to the church and the crown. Refusal meant immediate war. Many indigenous people did not even understand the language, and thus were condemned without comprehending the charges against them. Missionaries accompanied the expeditions. Some accepted the fusion of cross and crown, baptizing en masse those who had just been subdued. Others revolted against the brutality. Among them was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had once been a colonist and slave owner, but became a fierce defender of indigenous peoples. Las Casas publicly denounced massacres, enslavement, and abuses committed by colonists and soldiers. In his book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, he described scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Villages set on fire, children torn apart, entire families exterminated. For him, these actions not only stained the faith, but made it complicit in injustice. His outcry found an echo in other religious figures, such as Father Antonio Vieira, a Jesuit missionary in Portuguese territories who fought against the enslavement of indigenous peoples in Brazil. Vieira preached that the gospel could not be imposed by the sword, but must be received freely. This put him at odds with colonists and local authorities, who saw him as an economic obstacle. This sixth conflict, Iberian colonial empires versus prophetic voices of the church, showed that faith and empire did not always march in the same direction. While kings and explorers saw conversions as proof of success, critical missionaries argued that coercion and violence were incompatible with the message of Christ. The tension went beyond sermons. Las Casas took part in debates at the Spanish court, influencing legislation such as the New Laws of 1542, which prohibited the enslavement of natives. However, these laws were often ignored in the colonies. Imperial power prevailed over ecclesiastical determinations whenever economic interests were at stake. Had the missionaries' vision prevailed, the history of the Americas might have been marked by a slower, more peaceful process of conversion. Instead, the fusion of cross and sword left deep scars, destroyed cultures, decimated populations, and a historical memory that Christianity often arrived as an imposition. This conflict revealed an uncomfortable truth. The message of Christ could be proclaimed in two opposite ways, as liberation or as a tool of oppression, and which one prevailed depended on who held the cross and who held the sword. The next and final conflict would carry this tension into the modern era, when the Christian faith would face not an empire with armies, but an empire of ideas, the French Revolution and its cult of reason. The seventh great conflict between Christianity and a dominant power was not against a traditional military empire, but against an ideological one, the French Revolution and its cult of reason. Between 1789 and 1799, France sought not only to overthrow kings, it attempted to reshape the very soul of the nation, replacing the Christian faith with a new civic religion. The spark was the fall of the absolutist monarchy and the collapse of the Ancien Regime. The Catholic Church in France owned vast properties and privileges and was seen as an ally of the nobility. For the revolutionaries, dismantling the Church's power was just as important as toppling the throne. In 1790, the National Assembly passed the civil constitution of the clergy, turning priests and bishops into state employees, elected by the people and paid by the government. All were required to swear loyalty to the new constitution. Many refused, declaring that their primary allegiance was to Christ and the Pope, not the state. This refusal created an internal schism. The constitutional clergy, loyal to the government, versus the refractory clergy, faithful to Rome. Tension escalated into open persecution. Churches were closed, bells silenced, crucifixes destroyed. The revolution promoted the cult of reason, and later the cult of the supreme being, civic ceremonies that replaced Christian liturgy. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was turned into a temple of reason, where the goddess of liberty was celebrated in place of Christ. The bloodiest chapter came during the Reign of Terror, 1793-1794. Thousands of priests were imprisoned. Hundreds were executed by guillotine. In the Vendée region, Catholic peasants rebelled against dechristianization and were massacred under orders from Paris. This seventh conflict, Christianity versus the French Revolution, that was, at its core, a battle for the heart and spiritual identity of a nation. On one side stood the millennia-old faith that had shaped France. On the other, a movement that saw traditional religion as an enemy of liberty and progress. Some revolutionaries, like Robespierre, sought merely to reform religion's role rather than eradicate it entirely. But radicals like Hebert pushed for the complete destruction of the Church and the suppression of Christianity. The result was an environment where professing one's faith could cost freedom or life itself. The turning point came with Napoleon Bonaparte. Upon taking power, he recognized that the war against religion was dividing France. In 1801, he signed the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, partially restoring the Church's freedom while keeping significant state control over many aspects of religious life. Had the revolution succeeded in eliminating Christianity from France, the nation might have become the model for a fully secularized Europe in the 19th century. By surviving, the Church showed that even wounded, it could withstand ideological attacks as relentless as armed persecution. The seventh conflict left a lasting mark. It proved that in the modern era, Christianity would face not only swords and armies, but also ideas and systems seeking to redefine or erase its influence. It was the prelude to future battles between faith and secularism, struggles that still echo in today's societies. With it, we conclude our journey through the 7 great clashes between Christianity and the empires that shaped history. From pagan Rome to the French Revolution, the cross faced crowns, crescents, scepters, and flags. Each conflict left scars and lessons for the present. 7 times the cross met power, and 7 times the world trembled. From pagan Rome to the French guillotines, we saw emperors kneel, monks defy armies, cities burn, and missionaries denounce their own kings. What each of these conflicts tells us is simple yet unsettling. When Christianity allies itself too closely with power, it risks losing its soul. When it stands against it, it pays in blood, but keeps its essence. History proves that the faith of Christ is not fragile. It has survived the sword, the throne, and godless reason. But the question remains, in our time, faced with new empires, economic, cultural, digital, on which side will the cross stand? If this journey made you think, subscribe to Faith and Power, comment which of these 7 clashes impacted you most, and share this video. History does not end here, and the next chapter may be unfolding right now.